Thank you so much, Vanessa, and hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to have you here for this incredibly important conversation about the Affordable Housing Retention Act. This amazing turnout today really speaks to how much this issue matters and the opportunity it brings to expand homeownership, preserve affordable housing, and build smart public-private partnerships that really actually work. My name is Sabrina Lippman, and I have the esteemed privilege of being the CEO of Habitat for Humanity, New York City and Westchester County. Right now, too many families in New York are facing housing insecurity, but we've just taken a big step forward to protect what matters most, the ability to stay rooted in the communities we call home. Over the past couple of years, our top advocacy priority has been to help shape and pass this incredibly powerful new tool to address the city's housing crisis, the Affordable Housing Retention Act. This law tackles a very real and urgent problem. Thousands of affordable apartments in mixed income buildings built with public support are at risk of being lost as their affordability requirements expire. And the timing could not be more critical. With the federal government pulling back on support of affordable housing solutions, we need market-driven solutions that don't rely heavily on public funding for success. Here are some stats that really drive this home before I introduce today's speakers. 2/3 of New Yorkers rent, and we have the lowest homeownership rate in the country. A recent poll we ran showed that over 80% of renters want to buy the apartment and the unit that they live in. But the poll showed that nearly half of them expect to leave this city in order to eventually own a home. And with the cost of building a new home ownership unit now hovering around $800,000, we need new pathways to home ownership urgently. The journey to get this law passed was a true team effort. It shows what's possible when the private real estate sector, nonprofit housing and advocacy organizations come together to solve some of our most difficult housing challenges. And that's why the passage of the AHRA is such a win for renters, for property owners, home buyers, nonprofit housing orgs, neighborhoods, and for the future of our great city. It gives the state and city the ability to step in and preserve homes that would otherwise vanish into the private market. It protects tenants from being priced out and gives them something long overdue, a pathway to own their own homes. And while it applies to a specific subset of buildings, the ripple effect is massive. Every family that gets to stay in their home, every tenant that becomes a homeowner, that is a win for our communities and a New York where wealth building isn't only for the fortunate few. We are so proud to have worked across the housing advocacy community to get this law passed. And this is what true collaboration looks like. It's the kind of win New Yorkers need. More importantly, it's the kind of win New Yorkers deserve. And now comes the fun part. Implementation. The panel you'll hear from today includes some of the key people who helped make the AHRA a reality. They'll walk us through what the law means and how we can make it work for New Yorkers. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming our fantastic esteemed panel. Erica Buckley, partner at Nixon Peabody, Basha Edwards, Senior Vice President of Planning at the Real Estate Board of New York, and my colleague, Matt Dunbar, Chief Strategy Officer for Habitat for Humanity, New York City and Westchester. Matt, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Sabrina. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We are so excited to talk about the Affordable Housing Retention Act. And so let's get into it. So a little bit of background, the Affordable Housing Retention Act stems from some changes that happened in state law back in 2019 during the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act passage that amended the Market Act and changed some of the laws surrounding rental to homeownership conversion. So specifically, it adjusted the threshold for making a conversion plan effective from 15% of qualified bona fide purchasers to 51% of purchasers. And it made it so that every unit in a building would need to be sold for home ownership. So it essentially prohibited partial building conversions. So what that did was it essentially stopped what was a robust conversion market. So since the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act passed, there has been no new effective conversions from rental to home ownership. And so with our, as Sabrina mentioned, the cost of creating a new unit of home ownership being around $800,000, it really did stymie the creation of home ownership in New York City. And with our home ownership rate so low, you know, that has created a real problem in the marketplace for home ownership opportunities. So, and as of right now, we as a city are limited in what the city and the state can do in funding and creating the new home ownership opportunities. And those programs are limited both in capital, staffing, and capacity. So as a result, multiple aspects, multiple stakeholders within the sector came together to craft over a number of years the Affordable Housing Retention Act to help address this issue. So what does the Affordable Housing Retention Act do? It essentially creates a new piece in the GVL, the 352 Quint E, which would create a standalone section of the Martin Act that would allow for partial building conversions for a specific subset of buildings in the city to allow for that threshold to be changed back from 51 to 15% in specifically qualifying buildings in exchange for ensuring that potentially expiring affordable housing in those buildings is made permanently affordable and preserved, and in certain circumstances, increasing the percentage of affordable units in those buildings. So which buildings would qualify for this, for the Affordable Housing Retention Act? So essentially the qualifying buildings are buildings that were built in New York City that are 100 units or more and created after 1996 and include a portion of affordable housing within them. And so the programs that essentially helped create and establish these buildings include buildings that were built with 421A tax exemptions, low-income housing tax credits, bond financing, including Liberty bonds, and was incorporated with the inclusionary housing programs, mandatory inclusionary housing or voluntary inclusionary housing after 1996. The law does specifically exclude certain properties. So some of the properties that would not qualify under this provision of law, including any buildings that were built prior to 1996, including any pre-1974 rent stabilization buildings. It includes excludes all Mitchell-Lama properties, limited dividend companies, and redevelopment companies. Under the affordable housing units that would qualify include any units that are designated as low income under the IRS code that oversees low income housing tax credits and bond financing, anything deemed as affordable housing or income restricted housing under the 421A tax exemption program, or designated as affordable under the mandatory inclusionary housing or voluntary inclusionary housing programs. And I also want to just flag that if a building has passed its threshold, you know, under the regulatory agreement, but those units have remained and operated as affordable under these provisions, then those buildings would also qualify under the act. So what are the basic aspects of this Affordable Housing Retention Act law? So essentially what this law allows for these buildings to do is to do a partial building conversion of the market rate rental units, specifically, you know, the most common buildings being what are known as 80/20s, to allow for the market rate rental units to more easily convert and reach the conversion threshold from 51% back down to the 15% threshold that existed before HSTPA, in exchange for making the at-risk of loss units, which would be the units that would be approaching expiration, making those units permanently affordable, and those would also become rent stabilized. And so those units would be made permanently affordable. So think the 20% of units in an 80-20 building, those would be made permanently affordable and rent stabilized. In inclusionary housing projects, the threshold would need to increase generally the percentage of units that would be permanently affordable, that in generally those buildings already have permanently affordable housing. That threshold would be increased so that 30% of the building would become permanently affordable and rent stabilized. And in the context of Liberty bond deals, in which there may be a lower than 20% threshold on Liberty bonds, those would have to increase to at least 20% of the units in the building would need to become permanently affordable and rent stabilized in order to qualify under the Act. And in addition, upon re-rental of those units, the income target for those units would be readjusted to 60% AMI. So buildings that have a higher income on their restricted or affordable units would be reset to 60% area median income. And one of the areas that Habitat finds most critically important in these projects that would be taking advantage of this preservation opportunity would be for not-for-profit partner, qualifying partner, to be partnering with the preservation sponsor, so that as the rental units on the market would be converted to condominium and sold as home ownership, the preserved affordable units would be transferred to a partner not-for-profit organization that would take ownership and stewardship of those affordable units in perpetuity. And so that nonprofit partner would be able to essentially manage those units as permanently affordable rental, and in partnership with those tenants and with the partnering agencies, those tenants in the affordable units could have a pathway to affordable home ownership conversion as well. So an organization like Habitat for Humanity, which is really focused on preserving and creating affordable home ownership opportunities, we would be able to engage the tenants in the affordable units in a tenant opportunity to purchase approach and potentially convert those affordable units into a limited equity affordable cooperative for ownership by those tenants. And the last piece I wanted to highlight is, as part of these preservation plans and conversion plans, the bill also amended a section to create essentially and align with local law 70, so that in these conversion plans, there would be a capital fund, reserve fund for the condo at large, for the building, that would equate 3% of the revenues generated by the sales of the units for home ownership. So a fund would be created for the condo unit to deal with capital repairs and building-wide improvements, so that the condo starts off with that capital reserve for the entire building itself. And additionally, as we think about the stewardship and the preservation and maintenance of the affordable units that would be transferred to the not-for-profit qualified partner, another reserve fund specifically for the affordable units would also be created, which would be the equivalent of 0.5% of the sales of the building would go towards that reserve fund, which would help with the upkeep and the maintenance of the affordable units themselves, and be accessed and overseen by the not-for-profit owner of those affordable units in partnership with the overseeing agency. And supervision and enforcement of the law would be overseen by the attorney generals with a private right of action as far as the enforcement goes as well. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it off to our colleague, Erica at Nixon Peabody, to talk a little bit more about the preservation plans.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. All right, so obviously everything we're talking about today can only happen if the owner of the building files a preservation plan. So I'm going to try to go over some of the key components of what a preservation plan should look like. So first and foremost, preservation plans can only be non-eviction plans. So no eviction plans for preservation plans. The other thing that's kind of distinguishable from other typical rental to condo conversion plans, the review process is a little bit more expedited. So if you're filing just a regular offering plan to take a rental building to co-op or condo, there's this 4 to 6 month period before the AG will issue comments. For a preservation plan, the review is expedited. The AG review process starts after 30 days. As Matt had said, really a big, large component of preservation plans is that it's a partial sales program. And the preservation plan only deals with the offer and sale of the market rate units, and the affordable units are not a part of the offering. Some other aspects are that with regard to the excessive long-term vacancy test, this is, again, an anti-warehousing test. With regard to the market rate units, it's just like the current excessive long-term vacancy test that exists. So you can't have a long-term vacancies prior to submitting the preservation plan. And with regard to the income restricted units, on the date a preservation plan is submitted to the AG for review, all of those affordable units have to be rented up. Another key component of a preservation plan is, again, that the supervising agency that has been involved with the project, that they have issued a letter of support, and that there's an agreement between the current building owner about what the new regulatory agreement looks like. So again, when you submit a preservation plan, you need a letter of support from HPD, DHCR, whatever the supervising agency is, and the terms of the future regulatory agreement should also be worked out. Also, as Matt said, one of the really key components of a preservation plan is that the affordable units will be transferred to a not-for-profit. And so if you're an owner and you're looking to submit a preservation plan, you need to have identified your not-for-profit partner in advance of submission of the offering plan. And how the statute works is that if you submit the plan, it's accepted for filing and everything goes as anticipated, and the plan is, consummated, the not-for-profit has a year to take title to the units. Another note, just a little bit of a kind of technical difference, but similarity to regular offering plans, there's a separate filing fee regime. So the maximum filing fee for an offering plan is $60,000 versus $30,000. All amendments are $750. And if you were to do like a testing the market, an application to try to gauge interest, that application is $750. Okay, so obviously a big part of the AHRA and a preservation plan is protecting both market rate tenants as well as the income restricted rental tenants. So with regard to market rate tenants, here's just a bit of a summary overview of what they get. So first and foremost, like a regular conversion plan, they get a 90 exclusive day purchase period. They will also get a 6-month right of first option for after the 90-day exclusive period. And again, this is similar to the changes that were made to the Martin Act in 2019. Also similar to the changes from 2019, eligible seniors and disabled tenants, they also have a right to elect to become non-purchasing tenants, both at the date of submission as well as the date of filing of the preservation plan. So they'll have 2 bites at the apple to elect to become non-purchasing tenants and remove themselves from the offering plan process. Also a little bit unique is that if an eligible senior or disabled tenant elects to become a non-purchasing tenant, their rent increases mirror good cause. So if the good cause percentage increase for 2027 is 6%, that's what the permissible increase in rent would be for an eligible senior or disabled tenant. Something similar for market rate tenants, they will have the opportunity to elect to become a non-purchasing tenant. And if their rent is at the good cause threshold, then their increases would also mirror good cause increases. AHRA also has a very, very clear provision about access to building-wide amenities. So all non-purchasing tenants get access to amenities, and that includes market rate tenants as well. Another key point is that all non-purchasing tenants receive the protections of the Martin Act, regardless of when they moved in. So there's a bit of a divide right now in the first department and the second department about who is a non-purchasing tenant. Is it only tenants in occupancy when a plan is declared effective, or tenants that move in afterwards? Are they non-purchasing tenants? So for purposes of a preservation plan, basically anyone that's renting is considered a non-purchasing tenant and gets the protections of the Martin Act. Also, there are a series of protections for income restricted rental tenants, in addition to some of the things that Matt talked about. All units will be subject to rent stabilization, and there are some very early LIHTC deals out there where upon expiration of the regulatory agreement, rent stab actually may not be in place. So if you're filing a preservation plan, the income restricted rental tenants, they are subject to rent stabilization. Even though the income restricted rental units are not a part of the offering, those tenants receive protections of the Martin Act. So they are free, they can't be harassed, and they, again, are going to be subject to the same property manager as the market rate units. Similar to the market rate tenants, the income restricted rental tenants have access to all the building-wide amenities. The key difference is that it's at a nominal cost. It cannot be treated as rent, and that cost is going to be dictated by the terms of the regulatory agreement. And obviously, one of the biggest rights and benefits that they get is that their housing will be owned by a mission-driven not-for-profit that doesn't operate for profit, but just on behalf of those tenants. And also, as Matt alluded to, there is a TOPA provision in AHRA, which allows the tenants of the income restricted rental units to become an affordable co-op if they so choose. And last but not least, again, kind of borrowing from the reserve fund regime that's in effect under local law 70 for other types of rental to co-op or condo conversions, a preservation plan will lay out that the sponsor has to establish that typical reserve with 3% for capital improvements, but then there's also that additional 0.5% reserve that's just solely for the benefit of the income restricted rental tenants, and that money can be used for maintenance and upkeep. It doesn't have to be limited to just building wide capital improvements. So that's something that's also a little bit different. And let's see, I can't remember. Oh yes, one other slide. Sorry about that. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of highlight what are some of the sponsor obligations under a preservation plan. So if, again, you're an owner and you want to submit a preservation plan, you're going to be a sponsor, and there's a slew of things you have to do, but here's just a highlight of some of the key provisions. So again, as I said, first and foremost, you're going to have to get a letter of support from the supervising agencies that are currently involved with the project. You're going to have to iron out the details of the future regulatory agreement that is going to be in effect, that's going to regulate the income restricted units as well as the condominium. As part of the disclosures of the preservation plan, you are going to have to disclose some key aspects of that regulatory agreement. We talked about the fact that the qualified owner you're going to have to know who that organization is. You're going to have to disclose who they are. You're going to have to disclose any financing that they are going to have, as well as any tax exemption that may be in place for the income restricted units. There would be a budget for the first year of operations of the condominium, and that budget is going to have to go into detail about the operating expenses for the income restricted rental units and whether or not there are any budget shortfalls that require the owners of the market rate units to essentially cover the costs on behalf of the income restricted rental units. you're going to have to also kind of, you're going to have to discuss the provisions of the declaration and bylaw with regard to the income restricted units. And again, how any shortfall in budgets will be taken care of in the future, as well as the board structure that is meant to ensure that the income restricted rental unit owner also has a say on the board. And also, as Matt talked about, if a current unit's being rented and that tenant moves out, the AMI for all of the income restricted rental units will go to 60% of AMI. And you're going to have to disclose that, as well as whether or not any additional units have been designated as income restricted rental units. And that would be the case for, again, if there's a Liberty Bond deal where in most cases the affordability is only 5% and you're bringing it up to 20%, you'd have to disclose, which units are now also affordable, and same thing with the inclusionary housing units. Now, as we know, a big part of a preservation plan is that to declare the plan effective, you only need to sell 15% of the units. However, unlike what is required of any other type of condominium conversion plan, here the sponsor has to exercise commercially good faith efforts to sell at least 51% of the market rate units within 5 years. And they have to continue to update the plan yearly until they sell all units. So the structure here is to allow the plan to be declared effective with only 15%, but the sponsor has to continue to market and sell and create a fully viable condominium that's owner occupied. And also, last but not least, unlike local law 70, where it's a local law and it's overseen by HPD, sponsor will now have to comply with this new state law on setting up the reserve funds, and the offering plan will disclose specifically what those requirements are, what the amounts are likely to be, and their obligations under the reserve fund law. Okay, so that's sort of a little bit of an overview of a preservation plan, and I'm going to turn it over to Basha.
Thank you, Erica. Good afternoon, everyone. Great. So I'm going to thank you to Erica and Matt for walking through the details of the new statute, of the new act, and for Sabrina for kicking us off. I wanted to take a step back, so to speak, from the language of the statute and talk for a few minutes about how we got this done and why. The Affordable Housing Retention Act had broad support from across the housing and legal ecosystem, from, I would say, the traditional, yes, real estate lobbyists from Real Estate Board of New York, REBNY, to NYSAFA, to individual for-profit and not-for-profit developers, to the Bar Association, to folks in the, I would say, in the true housing advocacy space, like New York Housing Conference, and of course, Habitat for Humanity. I think when we think about like why everyone came together, is we were really talking about the alignment of interests and using creativity to kind of solve a number of public policy goals. We have, as Matt mentioned, a very constrained city and state pipeline for preservation deals. This is reliant both on property tax levy funds from the city. Real estate is the top contributor to that, but also funding from the federal government. These agencies have well documented for being, I would say, staff starved. New York Housing Conference has done a lot of work in that space in terms of what it means when you have open lines in HPD year after year. And this is also reflected, I would say, in a number of the program options that are available to folks when we're talking about preservation deals. 421A was the city's top producer of multifamily housing, representing nearly 70% of the production of multifamily housing in the last decade. Even if we had a perfect preservation program, even if we had a perfect J51, a perfect 421A preservation program, which has its own limitations, that's a lot of units to think about over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And I think that's why this act is so important. We are piloting a number of things in this. We are piloting, can for-profit and not-for-profit work together, ensure ongoing revenue streams to the affordable units, sort out a number of the questions I see we've already received and we had received prior to this in terms of what does this mean for amenity access? What does this mean for the setting of maintenance fees? And this is our pilot. We hope it works. And in a lot of ways, we know it will. And the reason we know this is going to work is because it has worked before. We're really lucky in New York City and New York State. We've done a lot of really amazing things in the advocacy space and the policy space when it comes to housing production and housing preservation. And sometimes it's going back to things that we know that worked and adjusting them for today. The benefits of the Affordable Housing Retention Act, this is a proven tool when we talk about preservation deals, when we talk about using existing buildings in new ways. New York City has a long history of reusing our buildings. And prior to the passage of the 2019 rent laws, conversions occurred in all 5 boroughs across a multitude of neighborhoods, a variety of housing stock, and it was 165 buildings converted to homeownership units, and that's approximately 6,208 units. With the passage of HSTPA, that pipeline closed. And I think what's really important when we think about this is what are the lessons we needed to take from that 10-year period? One of those lessons was affordability, income restrictions went away. That was I would say, a key thing REBNY certainly heard over and over again as we were thinking through other tax tools or other housing programs, is how do we preserve affordability in perpetuity? From a math perspective, from the real estate's perspective, the way you preserve affordability in perpetuity forever is ensuring there's a true revenue stream to support apartments that fundamentally are being rented or are being sold at prices that are less than what it costs to operate or build those units. And that's why this I would say this combination of really making sure there's market rate revenue to offset the affordable revenue loss is really, really important. And we know that this works. So for today, when we were looking at what's the urgency, should there be urgency around this? There's a lot of urgency around a lot of housing issues right now. Again, 421A really successful, LIHTC really successful, HPD, HDC, DHCR year over year hitting new, I would say, higher numbers in preservation and production. That just means we have a broader universe of buildings that could be viewed as at risk in a different way. And looking at the expiration years for a number of buildings across the city, again, we saw, okay, in the next 5 years, over 100 buildings with over 30,000 apartments are exiting affordable tax programs. That means units that were either rent stabilized, or rent growth was controlled for those tenants, and in a lot of cases, income restricted units as well. So when I mentioned the alignment of interest and why all of these different groups were able to come together, it's because we were hitting every single piece of like what makes good public policy. And maybe other people may have a different definition, but from my perspective, I think from our collective perspective, are there public benefits? Are there tenant benefits? Are there nonprofit benefits? And are there private owner benefits? When you hit across all of these different, I would say, benefit buckets, that's how you get a broad coalition of folks to support the policy. And that's also how, when housing issues feel harder and harder year after year, this took 3 years, as Sabrina mentioned, this is what allows public policy to move forward. Even when there's philosophical differences, even when there's I would say attitudes around who are better operators of buildings. Again, I think we're really excited to see how this works over the next several years, this pilot of ours, because we believe it will work. The public benefits, this is an additional tool in the toolbox for agencies. This is not about taking away from anything. We need to be really additive if we are going to solve our housing crisis. And that's both a crisis of supply and a crisis of ensuring that our existing units today are well maintained, they're taken care of, and that people are able to rent them or live in them. Also in the public benefits pool, when we talk about expiring affordable units, programs change over time. For a really long time, programs didn't think about permanent affordability. And part of that was a function of the tax benefits themselves. The tax benefit programs themselves were not meant to last forever. And market rate rents weren't necessarily where they were or where they are today, I should say. Again, Manhattan core is still driving those prices, but you have other neighborhoods that are also approaching higher rents on a per square footage. I think the other thing that's also really important, going back to this idea of finite public resources, for the city to take one of those 100 buildings with one of, some percentage of those 30,000 apartments and do a preservation deal, they are paying per unit for the entire building. This is a way to reduce the cost on that, or the burden to the city to ensure the preservation deal. And again, really focus resources on making sure we're delivering low income units for New Yorkers. The other benefit of allowing all of this to happen in the first place is the city and state get more tax revenue. This is from the mortgage recording tax, the real property tax law transfer tax, mansion tax, depending on the price points of these condos. Like, all of this is more money for the city and state. And again, if real estate taxes are, 53% of the city tax levy, that means more money for other preservation deals. That means more money for emergency service workers. That's real dollars when we know we're not going to get as much as we got it from prior years from the federal government. And that's just a really important thing I want to note in terms of the long-term financial stability for the city. On the tenant side, I think this was really important in terms of making sure there's the affordability piece, but also, there's a lot of conversation around how do we give people opportunity, whether it's tenants or not-for-profits, to play more in the housing space. This is, again, a way to pilot that. There's legislation that would like to apply this to all transactions. Clearly, REBNY probably has some concerns about that. Again, going back to that tax revenue piece in the time of transactions. But this doesn't mean we're ideologically opposed to tenants getting the opportunity to purchase the apartment they live in. And I think that's why we were certainly really excited about testing this out and giving people an opportunity and understanding how this was going to work. On the nonprofit side, you can't beat stable, well-maintained, permanently affordable units added to portfolios of good stewards. Like, there's nothing beating that. I think also important, again, thinking about the long-term financial viability and again, thinking about limited resources, the establishment of the reserve fund upfront, the sponsor mechanisms, all of this is about making sure that at some point in the future, the not-for-profit, the affordable units don't have to go back to the city and say, we need money. And I think that's also really important, both for the homeowners themselves, the tenants themselves, and knowing that this building, these portfolios are financially stable. For the private owner, fundamentally, this came down to flexibility. There are a number of changes that have been made over the years to how buildings are operated, to whether you can build new housing, how you build new housing, and what happens to the existing units that you own and manage. This is just another tool, similar to what happens for the public agencies, for an owner when their building is coming out of these programs to consider. All of a sudden, for an owner, you are going from paying nominal taxes, or some, I would say, a smaller amount, and for 421A, we refer to it as the mini tax, to doing full tax levy. That is 27% or more. That is a big jump. We're talking about buildings that are 15 to 30 years old. They need significant capital improvements. They need new boilers. They need new roofs. They probably need new windows. All of these things cost money, and this is an opportunity to refinance. So when we look at these benefits, again, across the spectrum, across these public policy buckets, this hits all of the things. And again, I want to say this is why we're really excited. We hope people use this tool, but you have other tools available, and we hope everyone is looking at their portfolio, at their individual building, and doing what's best. And when we look at what's best, it's making sure that people have access to those homes, that homes are in a state of good repair, and there's opportunities for more public-private partnerships, because we think that brings the best of all of our expertise and resources to bear for New York. And so with that, that is the end of our prepared remarks. We want to move into questions. And we do have a few already. So I'm going to start with those. And then if folks are feeling shy, we certainly got plenty of questions that were submitted as folks registered for the panel. All right. So I'm going to start with I would say this is more of a technical question. I kind of touched upon this as in this is an opportunity to figure these things out. So this is regarding what the allocation or percent interest in the common elements. How will this be addressed to or from affordable units? And, I think again, getting into what's the idea of will the affordable units bear their cost and versus what the condo units will bear. I don't know, Erica, or Matt, you want to take this one?
I can start. Again, when you take a building and you convert it to condo, there's a provision under the Condominium Act that requires you to allocate common interests. And there's 4 different methods, and there would be one method that would essentially allow you to allocate fewer common interests to the affordable units because of the unique factors and aspects related to those units. So like hyper technically, that's one possibility, that when you're creating the condominium and you're looking at your allocation of common interests for units, that it is possible that lower common interests may be attributed to the affordable. Why is that important? Because generally, condominium units pay their common charges based upon their allocation of common interest. So that's one thing that, we've been talking about and thinking about. The other big thing is that, like, more than a decade ago, the Condominium Act was amended to add 339M, which allows for special allocations of common interests in mixed income projects. This section of the Condominium Act was added to accommodate these types of deals, really from the new construction perspective. And so chances are the 339N tool would be used. And so essentially what that means is that the owners of the market rate units may, on occasion, pay more than what their common interest allocation requires if it's necessary to carry the costs of the affordable units. And again, this is a tool that's out there. I have reviewed many offering plans way back in my days at the AG's office for new construction luxury condos that had like an inclusionary housing component that were being set aside as rentals. That's why the law was amended. So we will likely use those 2 tools. Those are the 2 things that come to mind. And then Matt, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, what you're thinking about in terms of, tax benefits for, not-for-profit owners.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, just to build on that, as Basha mentioned, with the transition of the tax benefits away from the market units as those move into market rate taxes, the tax benefits would be sought for the affordable units as part of their long-term affordability. The not-for-profit steward would seek to establish a tax exemption to make sure that the carry costs for those affordable units are affordable for the long term as well. And in the circumstances of a conversion to an HDFC cooperative, we would be working with the city and with the tenants and with the local council members to establish an Article 11 tax exemption or similar type benefits to ensure that the carry costs remain low for the the homeowners of the affordable cooperative units moving forward. And that's all in partnership with the not-for-profit, as the regulatory agreements for those limited equity cooperatives now include a provision that maintains a not-for-profit monitor of those units to ensure that proper budgeting, proper governance continues to exist over time. So we would remain an integral part of the stewardship of the affordable units even after conversion.
Thank you both. I believe that also answers another question that popped up, which is the real estate tax treatment for these converted buildings in terms of, I would say the bifurcation of the affordable from the homeownership units, market rate homeownership units, and how that will be treated from a tax perspective. All right, we have a series of questions actually related to the income level for the affordable housing. I think both for when we say we're talking about 60% AMI and affordability, And then questions that were submitted, I think, to, what resources would be available if the not-for-profit component decided to also transfer to affordable home ownership. So
I can start with the AMI question. So again, I think the 60% of AMI was reached by looking at the universe of affordable units that would be, in these buildings. And so that range is 40 to 120%, with, again, the low income housing tax credit buildings being the lowest and some of the inclusionary 421A maybe being the highest. So 60% was seen as a happy medium. And just so that we're clear, it's that the rents must be set at 60% of AMI. In a perfect world, if we all of a sudden got additional, subsidy and we were able to do, bring additional subsidies in, that would be a possibility. There's nothing in the statute that would prevent that. So, but again, as units become vacant, the rents are reset to be affordable at 60% of AMI. And that was seen as a happy medium based upon the current AMI levels of the target buildings.
So for reference, for a 2-bedroom, 60% AMI equivalent rents is $2,187. We're not able to, I think, send everyone a link, but I have bookmarked this. It's very helpful. If you put into Google NYC HPD area median income page, you'll be brought to a page that shows you the different income bands, the percentages, and as adjusted by family size and unit. I think the other thing to note about the 60% is for a number of these buildings that are exiting the various programs, as Erica alluded to, like there was a very broad range of AMIs. 60% is, I would say, the table stakes when we're talking about the mandatory inclusionary housing program today, especially in high rent areas such as Manhattan and waterfront. And the idea, again, is general alignment of these various programs and tools to make sure we're delivering on an as of right basis. In some cases, the units that are the hardest to build from scratch, so to speak, from a new construction perspective.
And I'll just on the affordable home ownership cooperative conversion side of things, I believe the law would allow for those conversions to take place in partnership and under the guidelines of the existing conversion programs with the city and state. So in the circumstance in which the units are converted to affordable home ownership, that would be put together as a conversion plan in and of itself that would adhere to the rules regulating HDFC cooperatives, and most likely would not restrict it to 60% AMI, but more specifically take a look at the economics of the building and the co-op to make sure that it is sustainable as a affordable home ownership project moving forward in and of itself as well. So the 60% threshold is for the permanently affordable rental units, and that would be adjusted for affordable home ownership conversions.
Right. And just further, elaborating on that, Matt, you're 100% correct. The TOPA provision of the Affordable Housing Retention Act says that the conversion has to be for individuals and families at the AMI level under the private housing finance law. It cross-references that section 219, which is that very broad definition that allows the supervising agency to determine the AMI. Most of the home ownership deals that we're working on under Open Door or some of the other programs that they on average try to hit a 110, 120% of AMI. So you're right. And I did see, while we're on this topic, with regard to the 60% of AMI, that is the reset. So for example, if you had a LIHTC deal and the AMI was at 40 or 50, if the building is converted, a tenant moves out, that unit, instead of being a 40 or 50% unit, goes up to a 60%. And on the flip side, if it was an 80%, it goes down to 60.
Or in some cases, a 130%, it goes down to 60, right?
That's right.
And I think that's it's also important here to draw a distinction between units that had income restrictions versus units that were stabilized, which is a good segue for another. We're talking about some of those old 80/20s where you had rent stabilized units, but they were not income restricted. And the question is, what do you do? What's the reset at the point of you're looking to do this? Are you setting aside 20% as permanently affordable, or are you asked to do something else?
So in your typical 80/20 deal, you have to maintain, let's say it's a LIHTC deal. If the conversion plan is consummated, that's recording your condo deck and closing on a unit, the affordable units, the 20% would remain affordable. So if those units were currently subject to rent stave, the rent stave rents remain the same. But again, as that tenant moves out, if the rent is not affordable to a household at 60%, it would be adjusted. And then the units are subject to rent stave in perpetuity.
All right, so let's take the example of a 421A 80/20 or even any 421A building, I would say prior to 421A 16, where maybe the whole building was stabilized at the beginning of the construction. They're towards the end of their benefit period, so you have some percentage of the building that remains rent stabilized. How many of the units do they have to convert over to income restricted 60% AMI and stabilized?
So it's really just the 20%. And then the 80% would, continue under rent stabilization as required. And again, once the building is converted to a condo, the protections, like the tenants are subject to the rent provisions under the Martin Act. So again, if they're stabilized on the consummation date, that continues, again, depending upon the date of expiration and the lease riders and all of those details. But thereafter, the rents are governed under the Martin Act for the market rate tenants. If that answers the question.
I believe it does, but if the attendee is welcome to ask a follow-up. All right, our last live question, and then I'll switch over to some of the questions that were pre-submitted. Someone is asking, what was the reasoning behind the change from 15% to 51% threshold? I have some guesses and theories, but since this is recorded, I will ask the experts if this has precedent anywhere else in state statute or in prior policy.
I will say two things, and then Matt, I will just say two objective things. One, if you look deep in the legislative history realm, there was a precursor bill that was introduced that would have increased the threshold from 15 to 51%. And then if you look at the legislative history on the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act, there's one comment from Senator Kavanaugh about the increase. And it was really about, just voice and tenant choice. That's all we have. We don't have a lot. And what we do know is that the change was added to the Big Ugly on a Wednesday and became law on Friday. And there was very little public debate and dialogue on it. And I think for many people, it came completely out of nowhere and nobody was totally sure of what it was meant to accomplish. That's all I have. So, which is not a lot.
Yeah, and I'm still not sure where the 51% number itself came from. I did understand I would say from a legislator's perspective, if you're hearing, from tenants about, oh, they're converting these buildings and this is creating a lot of pressure to self-evict or construction harassment and all these things, if that's the narrative and that's your lived experience in terms of what you're hearing from your constituents, I understand wanting to increase the threshold, but I never saw like, here's why we're picking this particular number over 15%. There's a lot of numbers in between 15 and 51.
Right. Yep. And then I was going to say, there's also the idea that when you take a rental building and you convert it to co-op or condo, you want it to be viable. You want it to be owner occupied. And that is like, because we don't really know the genesis of the 51, I think it looks like the drafters of the Affordable Housing Retention Act said maybe one of this is that a condo become viable and all units sold, and therefore the bill does do that. So it accomplishes that, assuming that was a goal.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt.
No, I would just add, and knowing that the objective aspects that you mentioned is what we have to go on, but the other piece, just looking back at HSTPA, the goal was really to address items within rent stabilization law. And so I think some of the conversations that we've had in the past years, many of the legislators I think believed or were motivated by the notion of changing that threshold for pre-1974 buildings specifically, and just potentially because of the nature of the speed in which this piece was added to the legislation and passed, it can potentially be concluded that that provision was targeted towards addressing an issue with rent stabilized buildings. But of course, the change occurred market-wide and affected the entire market, which resulted in the 6 years that we've seen since, with very little conversions to homeownership.
Yep.
Okay. So now I'm going to move on. We have some questions, and I think this kind of gets into eligibility. If you do not have an expiring affordability component, you have, say, 10 years left on your program, or you didn't have an affordability requirement in the first place, how are you, or how is your project treated under the statute?
I'll start. So the bad news is, if you, let's just say you have a building and you somehow built it, or let's say it was 421A, but it wasn't in the geographic exclusion area, and therefore there was no affordability similar to extended 421A benefits, you're out of luck. This is just not, the type of building meant to be captured by the Affordable Housing Retention Act. However, maybe this will be so successful that those types of buildings could, in a future revision, be captured in exchange for affordability. So I think that's the answer to that, unfortunately. And then with regard to, like the timing of the restrictions. So the statute doesn't say, like, there's no requirement that the expiration must be imminent. So within a year or 2 years, it just says that at some point in time, these units are going to, the restrictions are going to end. And therefore, this is a possibility to ensure that there's no loss of units. And obviously, because you need the letter of support and the agencies have to be, partners in this, it may be the case that, if you have 20 years left on your restrictions and you go to HPD, they may say, you know what, let's come back in 10 years. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But the statute itself does not have any kind of requirement.
We have a lot of folks who submitted pre-questions commenting on the lack of options of finding affordable housing and how to build more affordable housing, which I think would be an excellent subject for a subsequent webinar if folks are interested, but I think a little bit out of scope for today. Certainly a longer conversation. There are several questions that I think get back into this relationship between the for-profit and the not-for-profit partnership here, and how enforcement will be done over time. And I think just making sure folks remain on an equal playing field in the operations and maintenance of the building. So Matt, Erica, feel free to answer that one.
Sure, I'll jump in first. I mean, as far as oversight and enforcement goes, as was mentioned, the affordable units would essentially, in partnership with the supervising agency, enter into a regulatory agreement, which would extend, as part of the conversion plan. So there would, essentially within the documents, overseeing the conversion, there would be that, ongoing requirement that these units remain affordable. And so any kind of attempts to increase the, the cost or charges to those affordable units that would become egregious or potentially result in unaffordability, that wouldn't be allowed, and the supervising agency, as well as I believe the AG's office, would be the ones to step in and participate in making sure that. Erica can correct me as the former regulator, but otherwise, that again, with there's the non-for-profit partner would be a partner with the condo board in the future, and be participating in that aspect of the condo board. And then, of course, the cooperative would have seats and participation in that as well. So there, it is a relationship, as with any kind of partnership or deal. All those details need to be negotiated and really established very clearly in the legal documents and the conversion documents, to make sure that everything is sustainable and all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted before the conversion is executed. But I'll pass it over to Erica.
I think you covered it, and the only thing I would add is that, again, the statute requires disclosure of the board structure and how to ensure that the board structure allows the owner of the income restricted rental units to have a voice. And I would also say that the AG is not going to have a role in enforcement. We could talk all day about their powers under the executive law, but their role is really limited to the disclosure requirements of the preservation plan. So I think it's going to be the supervising agency that's going to be overseeing their relationship and the financial issues.
All right, so we are at time. We did get through all buckets of questions in addition to the live questions. So thank you to our audience for participating, and appreciate everyone joining us during their lunch hour to learn about the Affordable Housing Retention Act. If any of my fellow panelists have any last words, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we will wave goodbye to folks.
Well, so much, and feel free to reach out to any of us to learn more. And it wouldn't be Habitat if I didn't do it. Please visit Habitat, nycwc.org to learn more about how you can support not only AHRA, but this incredible mission. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.